I just went to see this play and I need to talk about it. When I saw the poster for this play, I just had to go because if there's one thing to know about me, it's that I love Shakespeare and I love Marlowe. And a play about Shakespeare and Marlowe with LGBT themes, I simply had to go. It was like the perfect play for me, and it has Gatwa and Bluemel in it, who are both actors that I love and was just desperate to go. So I called up my nerdiest friend and I was like, we're going to this play. We're going. It's happening. I'm buying the tickets. Um, and honestly, my expectations were up here and they were met, they were surpassed. It was so much fun. It seems like a really serious, kind of more intellectual play when you hear that it's about two like 16th century playwrights. But it's very interesting kind of mix of lots of references to classic literature, but then also a lot of kind of like fun jokes and modern language that anyone can really understand. Like I think it was more interesting for someone who is a fan of Shakespeare or Marlowe, but I think that you could understand it. Like you could bring someone who wasn't really that interested and still enjoy it as a play and the kind of tension and the dynamic between the two of them. I think both Gatwa and Edward Bluemel really did an excellent job acting in this, and I think they had such great chemistry on the stage. And yeah, it was just a lot of good fun. But I wanted to make more of a review about it because I wanted to talk about some of the kind of references in it and the way that it's kind of brought to life this idea about these two playwrights, which they explain in the introduction to the script, which I bought at the play. In the author's note, Liz Duffy Adams writes, "A few years ago I read the news. The editors of the New Oxford Shakespeare had concluded that Christopher Marlowe had collaborated with Shakespeare on the three Henry VI history plays. And I felt the mad prickling in soles and palms and scalp that tells you, oh, there's something there." I think this is a really interesting kind of idea, and I think it was really cool to see where she went with this. I do think maybe this is just my brain, but it did almost feel a bit like fan fiction as a play, in some ways, in the way that they kind of took this idea of these two writers that people love and said, let's put them in a room together. There is evidence, and they kind of do a deeper dive into it in the introduction to this, where they talk about why people think that they collaborated on this play and how they might have done that. But obviously, we don't know if they were in a room together or if they were just writing letters to each other or sending in different parts of the play. We don't know how much they actually saw each other in person. It was a very long time ago. There's a lot of mystery around, particularly Shakespeare as a playwright, because there was so much, he wrote so many plays. We don't know, and we're not sure that all of them were written by him. And we also don't have, I mean, the only reason we have physical copies of his plays is mainly because people remembered them and were able to write them down later. He didn't write full copies of his plays at the time because it was such a period that was right before kind of stealing other people's artistic ideas. So he would give the actors one line and then the cue line that they needed, and that was kind of it. So there's a lot of mystery around these two figures, and I think it's really fun to see a particular interpretation of what they could have been like, how they would have interacted with each other. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what actually happens in the play, and then I'll get more into some of the references and some of the things I really enjoyed about it. The play centers a lot around the belief that Christopher Marlowe was a spy for the British government. The play brings this out as the main storyline and revolves around Christopher Marlowe explaining to Shakespeare that this is how he is financially stable as a writer, and also how he protects himself from the harsh criticism of writers and the morality that is needed for their plays to be approved, and how he gets around the censorship laws. There's kind of a running theme of Marlowe being the kind of older, more established figure. We do know this is true for At the time, Marlowe was very famous at the time he was writing, and people think he could have been the Shakespeare figure that we have today, the one that's being studied in schools, if he hadn't have died so young. I mean, obviously, Marlowe's works are still studied. I studied him at university, but I'd also already studied about 5 Shakespeare plays before I studied any of Marlowe's works, or multiple of Shakespeare's plays before I'd even knew who Marlowe was. So definitely, I think today Shakespeare is such a huge figure, partly just because of the number of plays he wrote, which, when you think about it, is just insane. Me and my friends sat down afterwards and worked out how many plays we'd each either seen or read, and I think I'd seen or read about 12, and he'd seen or read about 14. So, and that's barely only like a third of what he wrote. So there's just so much out there. I don't think either of us have seen or read the plays that this is focused on. It revolves around the Henry VI plays, which are some of his history plays. Personally, I don't have a huge interest in his history plays, so I have not taken the time to go and read them. They're not really hailed as the best of his works or the most popular. But if you have read them, it will probably add something to enjoying this play as well, because there are quite a lot of references throughout, and they read bits of iambic pentameter, which either were included or were kind of playing off things that were included. And the other main theme of this play is about the idea that they might have been queer figures. We do know that Shakespeare wrote sonnets about men, or at least we think that to be true. So a lot of people like to believe that he was bisexual. Marlowe is more of a difficult figure to know that very much about. As I said, he died very young. He died in a pub brawl, allegedly. A lot of the circumstances of his death are part of the reason people believe him to be a spy, because it didn't really make sense, or we know very little really about his life. But we know that he did write the play Edward II, and this kind of revolved around, as it says in the play, the king's boyfriend. So I'll get onto that in a minute. But there is also some belief that Marlowe might have been sympathetic to queer identities, or indeed he might have been queer himself. In terms of the start of the play, it's very witty, and it kind of builds on people's ideas of Shakespeare, what they already know about these two figures. I don't think you need to be a scholar of Shakespeare to understand it. A lot of it is references to things you would probably understand or could guess if you haven't already heard about this kind of element of their writing. They're kind of joking at the beginning about them writing a history play and the fact that it doesn't need to be historically accurate. That is one thing that people know about the history plays that Shakespeare did write, is that it was very much more focused on how they wanted these figures to be presented to make it interesting to the audience rather than historical accuracy. There's also a joke about the line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, and how that's kind of become a line that has been made fun of, because people think it to be very melodramatic and not very accurate to how people would maybe act on a battlefield. There's also a reference to Shakespeare's earlier plays. His early plays were a lot more violent and bloody than some of his later works. I think people tend to think of him more for his comedies as well. I mean, there are plays like Macbeth, which is very, very popular, obviously, but is still quite dark. But a lot of his very popular works, like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, are a lot more light-hearted. In this, while Shakespeare is asking why Marlowe, as a very established writer, has agreed to work with him, he says, "Why should you, the legendary poet of the great Tamburlaine, throw your lot in with me?" And then Christopher Marlowe says, "The hack writer of a derivative bloodfest." Having read through most of the play, having bought the script, one thing I will say is that when you buy scripts of plays after you've seen them or when you want to see them, the scripts are always so short. There's always so much that is added. I do think that this adaptation is quite loyal to the play. There's definitely a lot of fun stuff that happens in terms of the staging and the character choices, but in terms of the dialogue, as far as I remember, it's fairly similar to what's on the page. I assumed it was British because it's about two 16th century British playwrights, but it was actually first performed in Texas, of all places. So this is its first production in Europe and its first production in the UK. Even down to some of the stage directions are very loyal to, they're very descriptive, and they tell you almost exactly what you expect them to do. You have things like Kit gets back up and comes around to look at what Will's writing. And my favourite, which I think is so funny, is the stage direction that says Kit gets sexy up on him, Will is into it. So it's very much, it's not just a queer production of this play, it is very loyal to the text itself. I do think, I mean, you can tell from the poster that both the actors did a really good job of kind of getting into that element of it and portraying it in a really good way. If there's one thing that this play did really, really well was the tension between the characters. There was a lot of laughing out loud. There was the audience were like gasping at points as well. And I think also, I mean, I think in London there's quite a more international audience, but I do think that maybe this is just a stereotype I've made, but I do feel like British people don't tend to make that much noise. We're quite like sit back, just watch what's happening. So to get like the amount of laughter and the amount of gasps out of the audience was pretty impressive. And some other bits I really liked, they included, there's one part where Christopher Marlowe has an extremely long quill that he's using mainly to make bawdy jokes, but also kind of as a prop in making him more of a flamboyant and melodramatic character. I've also written in my notes the jump off the table. There's one part where Ncuti Gatwa jumps off the table, and Edward Bluemel is kind of lying on the floor and he jumps so far. It's very hard to explain, but he jumps where and like kind of lands almost on top of Edward Bluemel, which is just insane. I think it's details like this that really brought it to life. I think the staging was really interesting. It's very simple. I mean, it is just those two characters for the entire hour and a half play, and the only kind of staging is just the table in the center of the stage, and kind of that's it. But they kind of did it with the lighting slightly shifted, the table shifted around as it goes on, but it is really stripped back, and it really is all on the actors to make this play, and I think they did such a good job. So I wanted to talk a bit more about some of the references. I've already talked a bit about how Shakespeare's early plays were more violent than his later works. When they were writing Henry VI, this Shakespeare was still kind of up and coming, Marlowe was more established. So there was that kind of dynamic of Marlowe being this well-known figure who could kind of get away with writing more of the stuff he wanted to write, whereas Shakespeare was much more up and coming. There's also a lot of references to Shakespeare rewriting tales that already existed. This is again very true for all of Shakespeare's works. A lot of his works were rewritten, kind of existing stories. Obviously, he's done a really great job with them, and that's why they've kind of stood the test of time. But a lot of them weren't original stories, they were just kind of existing folk tales or existing ideas, maybe existing figures that he's then done his own interpretation of. Another part I wanted to mention in terms of both of their sexualities, there's a bit where they're almost kind of arguing, and Kit says, I'm not like you, I can't trim my sail for every wind, I don't have your flexibility, I am that I am and I can be no other, and that being so, I make no promises, I have said it over and over. And I really enjoy the mix of kind of more contemporary language and that kind of style of the writers themselves and how they wrote these plays. But I think also the reference to Will Shakespeare's flexibility is really interesting because, as I said, we believe him to be bisexual. So I think that's a really nice kind of reference for anyone in the audience who is aware of that. I also want to talk about the part about Edward II. This is one of my favourite plays. because I just think the premise is so ridiculous. So what they say in this play is, I read your Edward the Second while you were away. How could you get away with that? A whole play about a king's boyfriend. That is very accurate to what the play is about. The play revolves around Edward the Second and one of his advisors, and the rest of the court believe that him and his advisor are getting too close, and they conspire to murder him. And that's like the entire plot of the play. That is it. It's pretty much, we think that these two men are getting a little too comfy with each other, and we need to off him. Um, which I just think is insane for the time that it was written. But I did know that at the time of writing, there was kind of a tendency to make fun of LGBT relationships on the stage. As you know, at this time, there were no women on the stage, so all of the characters were being played by men anyway. So even when you see straight relationships in these plays, they will be being played by two men. So it does kind of make it ripe for kind of making jokes about that element of acting at that time. But I do think, I mean, I've read Edward the Second, and I do think that the presentation of the relationship to me felt very sympathetic. You also have some kind of queer elements in one of Marlowe's other works, Here in Leander, which is a retelling of a Greek myth. And in that retelling, Leander is kind of described as confusing people with his looks, that people think that he is a woman because he's so beautiful. And this means that some of the male characters believe, almost have feelings for him because they think he's just so stunning and beautiful. Which I think, again, is really interesting to read. I'd really recommend Here in Leander as well if you want to read more of Marlowe's works. I think people really know him for Dr. Faustus and some of his other plays, but Edward II and Here Leander are my favourites, and I think really underrated. And I think anyone who enjoys Shakespeare would probably enjoy them, but I think he is a little bit different as well if you want to read something from that time that is not just Shakespeare, because there were other writers writing at that time. And obviously, as we know, Marlowe was more popular at the time of writing. Okay, I'm going to try and wrap this up because I feel like I've just been rambling about some of my favourite 16th century playwrights. Yeah, in conclusion, if you are a fan of Marlowe or a fan of Shakespeare, then I'd really recommend going to see this play if you can. Like I said, it's only like a limited run in London, so I think it's only on for maybe another month. And I think when I bought the tickets multiple months ago, we nearly forgot it was happening. So I'd go get them now. If you can get a copy of it, or if you can go and see it, I don't know if they'll do more productions, then I would really recommend. Like I said, it was really funny as well. So even if you're not a big nerd like me, then you will still enjoy it. And I just wanted to talk about it as well for anyone who wanted to see it and didn't manage to. Sorry if you missed it, but hopefully this was interesting to hear a bit more about what was actually contained in the play, aside from this sexy image of these men. But what are some of the things they actually spoke about in the play and what the plot was. I didn't want to give anything too much away in case people did want to go see it. But yes, like I said, it mainly revolved around kind of spying part and then also the LGBT themes. Yeah, overall, I would really recommend this, and yeah, it made me really happy as a big Shakespeare Marlowe nerd. And I definitely, if you don't want to see this play, I would still recommend going and reading some more Shakespeare, some more Marlowe. I know that I want to pick up Edward II again. I want to read some more Shakespeare, and this has just really reignited that nerdiness in me about this period of playwrights, because there's just so much great content there. If you like this video, you can like this video or subscribe to my channel. I'm hoping to make some more videos about classic authors and how to start reading them, so I'd happily make one about Shakespeare or Marlowe if anyone is interested in that, so please do comment below if you'd like to see me make that. Otherwise, click the notification button so you can find out the next time I post, and happy reading!